Install the Vue CLI with yarn global add Vue CLI. Then once that's done, you can just use Vue init, pick a template. I'm going to use the nuxt/starter template and tell that to generate in my current directory, which is this egghead nuxt directory, which my editor is open in. So it prompts me if I want to do this. I'll say yes. It'll download it. I'll accept all the defaults. Then you can see there are files and folders generated from that, but I still need to yarn to install everything defined in the package.json. So that took about 43 seconds for the initial setup, which I skipped. But with that done, I can say yarn run dev to run the dev script of the package.json, which just tells it to run nuxt. So I'll go ahead and run that. You'll see some compilation output and that it's running on port 3000. So I'll go ahead and open localhost 3000 in my browser, and you'll see that Nuxt is up and running. I'll shrink it a little bit. And I would like to reduce this to a hello world. So I'm going to come into pages, index, select everything, hit delete, and say template. Then inside of your template, you need a root element. I'll just call mine div. Then in there, I'll say hello world. And when I hit save, this auto refreshes over here and you see hello world. Now you still see this visit our website for more documentation, which means that our main layout in default is adding this footer. And just FYI, this footer is defined in components, but I'm just going to change the layout itself and remove the footer and hit save. And now I'm truly at a hello world here. I'm also going to scroll down and you'll see a bunch of styling in here. I'm going to go ahead and delete all the styling and everything else so that there's no styles applied. So now my default layout is just a template with a div with my instance of Nuxt, and then my index page is just a template with a div and hello world. Lastly, the final things for configuration is I want to make sure that my title is inside of nuxtconfig.js. I'll make sure that my title is what I want it to be. I'll call it egghead todos. And then if there's any other settings you want to change in here regarding your favicons or meta in the head, you can go ahead and do that in here. So now when I hit save, I'll go ahead and refresh here. You see we now have egghead todos, hello world, and a clean default layout and a clean index page. To add a store to our project, we'll add vuex by creating a directory called store and putting a file called index.js inside of there. So you'll see that here, store index. And then I can export a const called state from this file, and then on this state I'll just say a counter has a value of 0. From here I can display this counter in my index.vue by adding the script part of our Vue file and export default. This is an object, and this object has a property called computed, and inside this computed I'm going to use what's called map state from vuex. So I'll grab map state and I'm going to spread it right away. So this is the object spread because map state returns an object and I want it to merge with this computed object. So I'll map state where the counter is a function that takes in the state and gives me the state.counter. Now if this looks weird, don't worry because the pattern will essentially be a bunch of these where you're telling the thing on the left that I want this thing off of the state. And then each of these are merged into computed by this object spread. So I'll delete all of them because I only need the counter, which is mapped to the state.counter. And then I can go ahead and drop that counter inside of here by saying counter. I'll hit save, and if nothing appears here and you try and reload and nothing happens, you'll probably have to restart your dev server here. So I Control-C out of that and yarn run dev again. That's because we added a file which we're importing, which isn't always picked up by dev servers. So we didn't do anything wrong in here, it's just that the dev server didn't pick up the fact that we added that file. So now you'll see that 0, which is this state counter 0, mapped into counter because we're kind of plucking it off of state here, and then displayed in our counter. To change this counter value in my store here, my store/index file, I'll export a const of mutations, and this is an object which declares some functions. I'm going to declare increment, and increment takes in the state, and it references state dot whatever properties I need, like counter, and I'm going to say plus plus. So when we call increment, it's going to take this state, referencing this state, and increment that value. So to do that from our view, we're going to do something very similar where I say map mutations, And I can grab those methods off of the mutations, and inside of the methods property in my component, I can go ahead and spread a mapmutations call, and this takes an array of strings which map to increment or any of the other mutations that are named inside of your mutations. So basically this means that now, instead of calling any sort of store.dispatch or referencing the store at all, I could come up here and create a button and say when I click on this button, call increment, and we'll just say this is a plus sign. Let's save here, and I'll click plus, and you can see this value going up. To see that process in reverse, let's just go ahead and create another button. I'll call this one minus, and I'll say when I click on this, I want this to decrement, and decrement wants to be mapped to a mutation down here. Say decrement, so I need to define that mutation in here called decrement, which takes in the state and says state.counter minus minus. Now I'll hit save here, plus plus plus, minus minus minus, where the click handler here of increment is mapped to increment on the store, which is defined here, where the mutation tells the state to increment, where the decrement mutation tells the state to decrement. I'm going to add the tachyons library to my project with yarn add tachyons. And you'll see it installing down here in the terminal. Then you'll see once that's done, it's down here in the node modules, tachyons, and tachyons has a CSS directory with a tachyon CSS in it. Now what I'm going to do is hop into my config file, my nuxt.config file. Now down in my global CSS settings, I'm going to add a comma after this CSS file and tell it to bring in tachyons CSS tachyons.css. So it's the name of the module in the node modules library, then the path to the file that I want to include. So I'll go ahead and save that. Then back in my index view file, I can go ahead and start adding the classes and styles that I want to include, like classes padding vertical 4. Save, and you'll see I now have this padding on top, and if I inspect it, you'll also see the padding on the bottom as well. So this PV4 class adds a padding on the top and the padding on the bottom, or PA4 would add padding all around it. 2 rems on top, right, bottom, left, as defined in the PA4 class. So to add any CSS libraries to project, whether it's Bootstrap or Foundation, just yarn install them, reference them by this path here, which is defined in your config and CSS, then the classes are available in the template. To add to-dos to our store, we can just go ahead and delete the increment decrement and replace counter with to-dos. I'll add a task of eat and then duplicate this and change it to sleep and code. Just like we displayed the counter by mapping state, I can go ahead and display the to-dos in the same way, to-dos. And I'll get rid of these map mutations because I don't need them. And also delete the buttons so that I can put in my to-dos. Hit save, and you'll see an array of to-dos rendered on the page. To style this a bit, I'm going to go to tachyons.io, go to the components, and down to the lists. Now this list looks great, so I'll just go here, scroll down, copy the HTML. It's just HTML and some tachyon classes. And then I'll go ahead and paste that into my index view. I'll clean up the formatting a little bit and just remove the padding I had before. So now when I hit save, I'll have that same exact component. I'll make this a bit smaller. And that's the same component from tachyons.io. So now I can delete all the other list elements except for the one I need. Add a vfor attribute and say to-do of to-dos, the to-do being each to-do in the array. So instead of this macro tabby, I can just go ahead and make that to-do dot task. So when I hit save now, you'll see eat, sleep, and code. And I'll remove this cats, replace it with to-dos. So now we have to-dos. To learn more about all these tachyon classes you see here, just go to tachyons.io. There's a great list of them on the table of styles. To load some to-dos into our application, let's first set up an API. So install a library called now. And the awesome thing about now is that it actually lets you deploy projects straight off of GitHub. And this project at John Lindquist To-Dos API, when you type now John Lindquist To-Dos API, we'll find it on GitHub, deploy it, and then give you a URL, which when I visit this URL, we'll have a server up and running where if I request to-dos, it'll give me back an array of to-dos. So with this link here, I can get and post and delete and patch and anything I want to these to-dos. So to load these in, I'm going to add a library called Axios, which gives me a nice clean way of working with remote data. So with that installed, I'll start up my dev server again, so yarn run dev. And then each page or each component, so for my index view, in my code here, a fetch will be invoked when the page is loaded. And fetch for me is going to be a function where I can Axios get that array of data. Now I'm going to use the async await syntax to make this a nice clean call to this promise. That way I don't have to .then everything. So this will be a response, and then when I get that response back, fetch also passes in an object with a store on it. So I can say store commit, and I'll say init, which is going to be a function on my mutations. So init, which will take a state and an array of to-dos, and simply say the state.todos is that new array of to-dos. And then back in here, I'm going to pass in the response.data. Now obviously this is telling me Axios is not defined. That's because I forgot to import Axios from Axios. And now when I save, and often when you get errors, it breaks that hot reload connection, so just refresh. You can see we now have eat, sleep, code, and this is now coming from here, so I can go ahead and delete these to-dos, and you'll notice that it's still loading in eat, sleep, and code. Now one thing that may be concerning you right now is if when you refresh, you'll see what's called a flash of unstyled content, where it goes from the unstyled font to the styled font, and the unstyled list to the styled list. And I just want to reassure you that this only happens in dev mode, where the server is injecting the styles after the page loads. And to prove that, I can deploy the site now using now, and the URL for that deployment is automatically added to the clipboard, so I can just paste it in here. And you can see when I refresh here that the styles never change. We get the styles immediately on page load or before the page loads, whereas on my dev server, if I start that up again, you'll see this little bit of unstyled content flashing, which is fine because this is dev mode and then this is production mode, and you never see those styles flash. Now it's quite possible that this initial request to load data could return an error or is the wrong URL or something, which would then cause our website to completely blow up because this is trying to server render this data. So if you try and server render improper data, then it simply can't render it and it'll throw a terrible error for your users. So what we can do here with async await is actually just try catch it. So we can try this, and if that fails, like it's doing right now, we can catch the error. And a graceful way of handling it is just to say store commit and initialize the data with an empty array. So when I save and refresh here, you'll see our main page with an empty to-dos data set. So if I add this back so it succeeds and refresh, you'll see we get our data. If this fails, I'll save and refresh. You'll see that we get no data, we just get this empty array. Or we can just add a new page in our pages called something like error. Make sure we have a template, div, oops, our services are down. And then in our index, along with a store, we also get redirect. And redirect can just say, well, it's not even worth coming to our site right now, so just send them over to the error page. So with this, when I refresh, you'll see, oops, our services are down. But if I fix the URL, hit save and refresh, well, I mean, if I refresh on the base URL and not on the error page, you'll see we have our data again. So you have your choice of either requesting and storing initial data before the server render, and then making sure that you catch it if it fails. Or instead of using fetch, you could wait until the component is created. I'll grab this, copy, paste, comment my fetch out, then make sure I use this $store because the context isn't passed into created, and this .store wasn't ready at the time fetch was ready, so that's why it's passed into fetch. So now the experience, oh, and you'll see I need to make sure that this is async. So now the experience when I refresh is you see to-dos, and then you see the data loaded. We'll see that again, to-dos, and then the data loaded. Or the experience with fetch is when I refresh, everything's ready. So refresh, everything's ready. And remember that flash of unstyled content goes away when you deploy to production. And one last note, there is a default error page here. So if I navigate to something that doesn't exist, I'll say no, hit enter. You'll see we get this 404 error page. And that's defined in these layouts error. And you can come in here and customize anything you need to for this default error page. And you can also use it from this context. So store, redirect, another thing that's passed in is an error function. So instead of saying redirect, you could just say error with a status code of, we'll just say 500 for the internal server error, and then a message of oops, try again, or something like that. And I need to name this something else if I'm going to pass in an error function, so we'll just call that error. So now if I break my service, hit save, I'll come back and reload the route. Looks like I didn't make this an object, so I'll save that again, and now refresh. You'll see we get the 500 oops, try again, which is that error layout that you can customize. So however you want to, you can handle that error. I'm going to use my redirect. To navigate to another page, let's say we add a nav up here and then toss in some nuxtlinks. This will go to /completed. We'll call this completed. And then I'll create a completed page, new file, completed.view, and then basically just copy and paste this entire thing in here. Now the behavior we want is if I go to completed and it loads the data fine and I refresh, it should load the data fine. But the unexpected behavior here is if I go back to home, let me open up the dev tools to see the network. I'll go to completed, and you'll see it actually makes this request to load the to-dos again. Now we don't need that because we already have the to-dos stored in our store. So in our fetch, I'm going to add from the context the isclient. And if this isclient, I'm just going to return out of fetch, meaning it'll just skip over all of this stuff. So now when I save and I go to home, and I clear out the network and I go to completed, you'll see it doesn't make that request in the network to this service, but it still has the to-dos from the store. So this way I can navigate through my site without reloading the data each time, and I can even refresh, and when I refresh it makes that request on the server, but it never has to make that load on the client. So what I can do, because this fetch function is being used across multiple pages now, the home and the completed, is I can cut it out of here, in my pages create a new file, and I'll just call it shared.js, and I'll paste my code in here, and I'll just export an async function and rename this from fetch to init, just so it doesn't collide with the fetch library. I'll format that a bit, and now I can, in completed, I can say import init from shared, and I'll say fetch is init, and just do the same thing in my index where I import init from shared, and now fetch is init. So when I go home, you'll see I start redirecting to my error, and right away I notice that I haven't imported Axios here, so I can grab Axios, drop that in my shared, hit save, and now navigate back to home, and now home is using this shared, and completed is using this shared as well. So let's go ahead and delete the import Axios from here. Fetch is using init. Fetch is using init, so that as I navigate, so on my completed page, I'll navigate back to home. On my index page, I'll navigate to completed. You'll see that as I refresh, clear this out, I'll go to completed, I'll go to home, completed, that I never actually make another request to load this data. It's only loaded before the initial server render, and from there on out, we're operating on it on the client. And from there on out, we've stored the data in the store, so we can just grab it from there instead of having to request it again. I found a nice title link list navigation to use for the navigation of our to-do app. So I'll copy and paste that to where our nav was. We'll format a bit, and then I can clean it up so that it displays the things that I want to display and not just the stuff I pasted. So we're going to have 3 links. I'm going to get rid of everything but the first one. That way I can change this to a nuxtlink and nuxtlink, then change the href to a 2, the root URL, and change site name to home. So that should look pretty nice for us. And then let's go ahead and add the other 2. One for active links, active, the other one for the completed to-dos, and that'll be at completed. So we'll save this, and we have home, active, and completed. So now let's make it so only the current active link is the one that's highlighted. So you'll see if you open the dev tools that if you highlight the active link, and I can't hover off of this without making that disappear, but you'll see a nuxtlink active right over here. So we can target a.nuxtlink active in our own styles. So we'll say style, and we'll scope this to our component. I'll say a nuxtlink active. To make sure we got it, we'll say font size 5 rems. Hit save, and we've obviously found the active link. Let's go ahead and make the inactive links gray and remove the bold, hit save, and now we can just make our active link color black, font weight, bold, hit save, and now it looks a little nicer. So now we can extract this navigation into its own component. So I'll cut this out and create inside of the components directory a navigation.view. This needs a template, and inside that template I can paste everything we just made. And I'll also go back and grab the style that we declared in here and paste that in here as well. So now in my index to use this component, I need to make sure and import navigation from, and this is a special aliased path that uses the tilde, where I can say components without having to navigate up directories with a ... and then just navigation. So I'm in pages, I could do ... and then components and navigation, or anywhere in any of the pages I can just do the tilde components to avoid all those ... So now that I've imported the navigation, I can say components on my component, say I'll use navigation, and then just go ahead and drop the navigation where it was before, hit save, and we're back to where we were before. So I can copy this, paste it in completed, where this navigation is, hit save, and now when I navigate to completed, you won't see it show up because I'll have to import and then define it, and I'd have to do that on every component I use that in. So instead of doing that, it makes more sense to grab the navigation and drop it in the default layout, where I can just ask it to live above the Nuxt instance, make sure in my index I don't need this stuff anymore. I'll go back to my default layout, define my script, import it, export default object that takes components, and define the navigation. And now when I hit save, you'll see the navigation shows up even though I'm in the completed path. Now you'll notice that home is active even though we're on the completed path, and that's because this slash here means that it matches the root path as well. So to fix that, we need to make sure we say exact on anything that might have a child path. So only make this active if this exactly matches what that is. Then that'll make that go away when we're on the completed path. I can navigate home, we're back to home, completed, and we have this navigation across our site. So even if I just make a single page for active that has nothing but a template and an empty div in it, when I navigate to active, you'll see I have this active page with a navigation, even though my active page is just a template with an empty div. So this navigation will work across all the pages, and it's refactored into its own component and then used inside of the default layout. Now we can add a basic form. We'll get rid of the action with an input with a type of text, and we'll use this input to submit new to-dos to our API. So we'll handle the submit event on the form and tell that to call a method, which we'll just call onSubmit. So down in our methods, we can say onSubmit and then alert. Yay. So hit save here. And the first thing you'll notice is that when you try and submit something and hit enter, it'll do the alert, and then it will refresh the page because that's the default behavior of the submit event. A great convenience with Vue is you can say submit.prevent, and that means it'll prevent the default. So when I hit save now, I can type yay, hit enter, it'll pop up the alert, and it will not refresh this time. So to prevent that submit event from refreshing the page, just do a .prevent here. Now let's track a value on our input using vModel, and we'll just name this task. And for something to be on the vModel, we have to define that in our data. So we'll say data, which is actually a function, which returns an object. And we'll say the task is just defaulting to some task, just to show it working. I'll hit save here, and you can see some task pops in automatically. So to get this value into onSubmit, we can just invoke onSubmit, pass in the task then on submit, receive the task, and then alert the task, hit save, and you'll see I'll type in something, hit enter, we get some task something, and everything is wired up properly. So from here, to get this into the store, I'm going to bring in map actions from vuex. And this behaves the same as the map mutations and map state, where on my methods, I can spread this object we get back from map actions. I'll just do the array way. I can pass in a string, call this add, and then I can open up my index.js from my store and start creating some actions. So I created an action called add, and add takes in the context and the thing we passed in, which was the task. So this task is wired up to this task, and I need to make sure that on submit is now add, because add is mapped to this add map actions, means that this add is wired up to here. So that event from submit is going all the way into our store and being handled here. The task is handled there. So my context contains, so I'll destructure this, contains something called commit, which will commit something to our mutations. So I can say from here that I want to commit to add, and then an object with our task, and complete is false. Then I need to make this add that I'm committing to say add state to do, and this to do is this object. Then I can say that our state.todos is an array with the previous to-dos and our new to-do. So I'll hit save here, and now when I hit enter in here to submit the form, I can add a bunch of tasks. Now for now, these will survive as I navigate around, but as soon as I refresh, they're gone because we are not posting them to the API. So let's fix that by grabbing our API call, and I have a great example of that in our shared, where we get the initial from Axios, get the initial data. So I'll copy and paste that into my store and say that I now want to post to this. And if I'm going to use await, I need to make sure that this function is async. So when I post, I'll get a response back from this. And what I want to post is this object. The object that I was just pushing into the array before, I now want to post to my service. I'm going to bring this down to the next line just to make it more readable. Then, since we're awaiting for this to happen, once that's done, I can just go ahead and commit the response.data, which will be the result back from my post call. So I'll go ahead and save here. And now when I add some task and hit enter, it didn't work, but I'll check my console, and it looks like I didn't define Axios again since I copy and pasted and I forgot to. So we'll go up and import Axios from Axios, hit save, and now when I hit enter, you'll see that some task comes back. Now this time it does take like one beat. After I hit enter, you'll see it takes just kind of 1 second to post, get the response back, and update the array. And that's because it's actually posting and saving that to our API. So when I refresh now, I have my sum task and my 1 beat, and I go to completed, it's still there, and I can refresh here as well. Now you'll notice that each to-do also has a to-do.id, which means that I can use this ID 1, 2, 3, or if I had another one, you'll see 4. I can use that ID to look it up when I request to delete one of these from the API. So I'm going to put this in a span so that I can add some buttons behind it. And that way in my class I can say flex, and then in this I can say flex auto to basically take up the remaining space and push my buttons to the right. And then in my button I want to put an image, and the source can be, there's a great little service at icon.now.sh. If I look this up, icon.now.sh, I can find the icon I want. We'll just find a trash can one. I'll search for trash, and this will be fine. So I'll copy this, paste that there. Now I have a nice little trash can where I can delete these. Let's also align this down since that expanded the height of the button. So we'll do items dash center, which just did the align items center. So now when I click on this trash can, I want to say click, and we'll say remove. So this remove is what we want to map to an action, remove, which will then map to interactions and async remove, which will have a very similar signature here, where this takes the commit and the task. Actually, this one's going to be the to-do, since I want to get the to-do ID off of it. And then I'm going to axios delete, and then this string, I want to turn it into a template string, so I can target the to-do.id and send a delete request directly to that to-do ID. I don't need to pass anything else. It'll just go ahead and delete that. Then after that's done, I can pass on that to-do to a committed mutation, where I say remove. I can go ahead and duplicate this down, say remove. And now state to-dos is going to be a filtered version of state to-dos, where if the to-do.id is not equal to the to-do ID that was deleted, that means we want it. So we're basically getting everything but that to-do ID that we deleted. So back here, just need to make sure we're passing in our to-do to that remove, which I'll pass in to-do right here. That's coming from the to-do of to-dos. So the workflow here is to-do, goes into the remove. This remove is in map actions. So it's here, which is mapped to, in my actions, this remove, sends off the delete request. Once that comes back, we can just commit remove the original to-do, since this doesn't really return anything. It's just deleting something. And then on the front end, we can remove, commit this mutation by filtering out that to-do. So I'll go ahead and save and try this out, and I'll click this sum task, and now it's gone. I can click sleep, because no one needs to do that. And now we only have eat and code left. So I'll add sleep back, hit enter. You could see we have sleep at number 4. I'm just going to add a tiny bit of formatting here. We'll do to-do ID dot with a space, so we can see those numbers a bit better. And then in this form, I'm just going to give the same classes, the article, and maybe even give it a input submit button with the value of add, just so you could click on that if you didn't know that enter was available to hit to submit something. Now let's go ahead and add another button in here. This one will be our toggle to do, and instead of the trash can, we'll use a check mark. So you can see that in action. So we have our check marks in there. And then on our actual task name on this span, we'll say vbindclass, so that if our to-do is complete, it'll strike it out. Strike is a class from tachyons that represents the tech decoration line through. So we'll say to-do complete. We'll strike it out if it's complete. None of them are complete right now, so just to make sure this is working, I'll say strike it out if it's not complete. So that looks like it'll work. So let's wire up this toggle button. So we want to toggle and duplicate this. And instead of remove, now we have toggle. And then instead of axios delete, we're going to axios patch. And we'll patch that same ID just like we deleted. But what we're patching this time is the complete to not true, but the opposite of what complete currently is. So that will toggle it instead of just setting it to true each time. And then we can go ahead and add toggle here as well, so that we have a toggle mutation. So I'll duplicate this, call this one toggle, and instead of filtering this time, we'll do a map that checks if this to-do ID is the same as that to-do ID. So I'll just do this in a short ternary statement here. If that's true, then we want to return this to-do. Otherwise, return the original to-do. So let's make sure this to-do is coming back as the right thing, because now we want the response data, not the original one. So we'll get the response.data. This is the toggle to-do coming back from the patch request. So I'll go ahead and save now. And if everything's wired up, I can check off eating, refresh the page. You'll see that eating is still checked off. If I go to completed, I can check off sleeping. I can delete sleeping, can toggle back on eating, and I can add another task, check that one off, and delete it. And it's toggling simply because we have a button which when I click toggles a to-do, and that to-do is being passed to toggle, which is mapped to an action of toggle, which then patches on our API. We get that response back, and I commit that response to a toggle mutation. Defined here, that to-do comes in, And our array of to-dos just either grabs the original one, or if they match, it grabs the new or updated one we got from the API response. So to finish up the other pages, I'll just copy and paste all of this into the active view. So now when I hit save, if I navigate to active, it should look the exact same and have all the same features. So let's remove some of these features. We'll remove the form. We'll call this active to-dos here, and even get rid of the ability to click on the buttons. So now active is just a list of active to-dos. Then if I go back into home and check off eat, when I go back to active, it's still showing eat. So let's make sure that's filtered out. And I can just do that in this computed state here. So I'll just say filter out any to-do where the to-do is complete but not complete, like that. So now in active, it'll only show us the ones that haven't been completed. So home looks like this, active looks like this. Then I'll copy and paste everything from active into completed. So paste that there. So then I can also clean up the methods. I don't need any of these. I don't need the data. I don't need this import. So my active view is really short with just a template and a list that loops through my to-dos. So I'll copy and paste this into my completed, select all and paste. So now completed will just be the same thing, except it only wants to show complete ones. So now if I navigate to completed, looks like I accidentally deleted map state. So let's import that back. Map state from vuex, and active will need that as well. Refresh here, and now completed shows active to-dos, so let's change that to completed. And we can even get rid of the strike through on this, so that now completed to-dos are eat, active to-dos are code, and back in home I can add another, build something cool, read a book. So we'll check this off, navigate to completed. You'll see eat and build something cool, and I can refresh. I'll have the proper things, go to active, have all the proper things there. Then in my terminal, I can even just say now and deploy this application. And once that's complete, I can just go ahead and open this in a new tab, hit enter, and now we have this application live online where I can complete, completed, active, home, delete, and everything works just as expected.